India is not simply a country on a map. It is an ancient idea, a civilization so profound that it stretches back into the depths of human history, where most of the modern world has no memory. Nations today often rise and fall within centuries, sometimes even decades, but India has carried forward a living tradition that is measured not in hundreds, but in thousands of years. This is not the mark of a weak or transient society, but of one that has continually shouldered the immense weight of survival against adversity. Every empire that sought to dominate it, from the Persians to the Mughals to the British, eventually faded, while the Indian civilization endured. That tells us something about strength. It tells us that a people rooted in responsibility cannot be eradicated. They adapt, but they do not dissolve. They bend under pressure, but they do not break. To respect such a nation is inevitable. To fear it is equally rational. The endurance of India lies in its acceptance of responsibility for existence itself. A civilization survives not by denying chaos, but by confronting it and weaving it into order. India's philosophical traditions, whether it is the Vedas, the Upanishads, or the teachings of the Buddha, represent attempts to wrestle with the most fundamental questions of meaning. What is truth? What is suffering? What is the path to order amid chaos? These questions have echoed across millennia, and India's thinkers answered them not just with abstractions, but with living practices like yoga, meditation, and spiritual discipline. This is responsibility at the deepest level, the willingness to confront the existential burden of life and to cultivate resilience against it. That resilience has been embedded into the DNA of the culture itself, forming a foundation so durable that no conqueror could erase it. Respect arises when people see responsibility taken seriously. A child respects a parent who stands firm, who sacrifices comfort for the sake of order, who takes on the heavy load so the family can survive. Likewise, the world respects India because it has borne the load of an ancient heritage without abandoning it for the shallow promises of modernity. Many societies in the modern age, in pursuit of progress, cut themselves off from their roots, and they drift into confusion. India, however, has continually found ways to integrate tradition with innovation, spirituality with science, community with individuality. That integration is not easy. It is painful, it is messy, but it is also the mark of maturity. And maturity always commands respect, because it speaks of responsibility that has been earned, not borrowed. But let us also consider fear. Fear emerges when strength is not merely inherited, but proven over time. The world fears what it cannot easily uproot, and India's civilizational weight makes it immovable. Empires attempted to dismantle it through force. Missionaries attempted to erase it through ideology, and colonial powers attempted to replace it with foreign systems. Yet each time, India absorbed the challenge, transformed it, and emerged with its identity intact. That is terrifying to those who seek dominance. Imagine trying to cut down a tree whose roots stretch deeper than the foundations of your own civilization. You may strike at its trunk for centuries, yet it continues to grow. That is why the world not only respects India, it fears its permanence. Responsibility also manifests through continuity. It is one thing to preserve a static culture, but India has preserved a dynamic one. Every generation has taken on the responsibility of carrying forward tradition while adding to it. This is why Indian civilization has never stagnated. Its literature evolved, its music evolved, its political structures evolved, and yet the thread of continuity remained unbroken. This requires a tremendous collective discipline, a willingness of millions of people over thousands of years to see themselves as custodians of something greater than themselves. That sense of responsibility is not abstract. It is lived daily in rituals, in family structures, in festivals, in art, in the very way life is conceived. The burden is heavy, but India has never put it down. We often underestimate the psychological depth required for a society to carry such a load. Most individuals collapse under the weight of their own suffering, unable to reconcile with pain, tragedy, and loss. Yet here we have a civilization that confronted famine, invasion, colonization, and partition, each capable of tearing a people apart. And still it held together. How? By continually returning to responsibility, the responsibility of preserving memory, of telling stories, of maintaining traditions, of passing on wisdom. Responsibility transforms suffering into something meaningful, and meaning allows survival even in the darkest of times. That is why India survived when so many other civilizations disappeared into the dust of history. It did not turn away from suffering, it transformed it into continuity. And continuity breeds confidence. When a civilization survives for millennia, it begins to recognize its own permanence, and that permanence radiates power. This power is not simply military or economic. It is psychological, cultural, and spiritual. The world recognizes that when it negotiates with India, it is not negotiating with a temporary construct, but with a civilization that has endured all storms. That makes India less pliable, less willing to be dominated, less likely to surrender its sovereignty. And this creates fear, because the global order often seeks malleability in nations. It wants compliance, not independence. But India's very identity is tied to independence. This independence is not arrogance. It is responsibility. The responsibility to remain true to itself, regardless of external pressure. It is also crucial to recognize that responsibility begets identity. In today's world, where identity crises tear apart societies, India's continued existence as a coherent civilization provides a stabilizing contrast. The Indian identity is complex, diverse languages, religions, and cultures, and yet it is held together by a deeper sense of belonging. That belonging arises from shared responsibility to the civilizational project itself. This is not a shallow nationalism. It is a profound civilizational unity rooted in responsibility for the past, present, and future. The world respects this because it is rare, and it fears this because it cannot be easily imitated. A nation with identity born of responsibility is not fragile, it is formidable, and so, the respect and fear India commands today are not accidents of politics or temporary economic trends. They are the inevitable results of thousands of years of responsibility, shouldered consistently, generation after generation. To understand India's strength is to understand responsibility as the highest virtue, the load that when carried, produces resilience, continuity, and identity. Respect is given to those who accept the burden. Fear is reserved for those who cannot be broken by it. India has proven both. India's intellectual contributions to the world are not minor achievements tucked away in forgotten history books. They are pillars upon which much of human civilization has been constructed. The concept of zero, the foundations of algebra, the insights of Ayurveda, the depth of Sanskrit grammar. All these innovations emerged from a people willing to wrestle with the fundamental structures of reality. A society earns respect not simply by surviving, but by producing knowledge that transforms the way humans think and live. To create is to take responsibility for the future, and India has done so repeatedly, and this is no trivial matter, because knowledge is the most enduring form of power. Empires collapse, monuments crumble, armies dissolve into dust, but ideas persist and infiltrate every corner of the world. India's ideas live on, shaping minds long after the empires that tried to rule it vanished. That is the mark of true influence. To understand why the world respects this, we must remember that intellectual creation requires courage. It is one thing to inherit knowledge, but another to generate it out of nothing but observation, thought, and discipline. Imagine the audacity it takes to propose that the universe itself operates through patterns of numbers, or to map the stars with such precision that modern astronomers still acknowledge ancient calculations. That audacity is not arrogance, it is responsibility. It is the decision to bear the weight of asking questions no one else has yet dared to ask, and to persist until answers emerge. The world respects India for carrying that responsibility across millennia, through scholars, sages, and scientists. But respect turns to fear when that intellectual courage does not fade, when it continues to thrive in a nation rising into the modern world with equal vigor. Today, India stands at the forefront of technological innovation, information technology, and space exploration. It is no longer confined to the wisdom of the past. It is demonstrating its intellectual vitality in the present. The Chandrayaan missions to the Moon, the Mars Orbiter mission, the rapid expansion of artificial intelligence research, all these showcase a nation that still refuses to outsource its responsibility for knowledge. When a civilization demonstrates such continuity, the world pays attention. Respect arises because this is no mere historical relic. It is a living mind, a thinking force on the world stage. And fear arises because intelligence, when combined with ambition and population, becomes nearly unstoppable. Knowledge is a weapon sharper than any blade, and India has wielded it for thousands of years. It is important to recognize that the production of knowledge is not an accident. It arises from a world view, a philosophy of existence that encourages curiosity and discipline. India's philosophies, from Vedanta to Buddhism, do not shy away from complexity. They invite individuals to question everything, to seek meaning beneath surface appearances, to engage with paradox instead of fleeing from it. This intellectual climate fosters innovation because it teaches people to endure uncertainty without collapsing into despair. The world respects a culture that can train minds to hold chaos and order in balance, but the world also fears such a culture because a mind comfortable with paradox cannot be easily manipulated. It cannot be forced into simplistic answers. It resists domination. That independence of thought is a power unto itself. Intellectual power, when combined with technological ability, creates leverage in the global order. Nations that cannot innovate become dependent. They rely on others for survival. But a nation that continually produces knowledge ensures its autonomy. India is reaching this point. Its engineers and scientists are not merely working for other nations, but for their own. This independence changes the dynamic of global respect and fear. Respect, because the contributions benefit all of humanity: cheaper medicines, space technologies, and digital solutions that reach millions. Fear, because this independence makes India less controllable, less pliant to the pressures of dominant powers. Knowledge, once possessed, cannot be taken away. It becomes the ultimate shield against domination. And knowledge, when shared wisely, multiplies respect even further. India has not hoarded its intellectual wealth selfishly. It has often shared it with the world. Consider yoga, meditation, and Ayurveda practices once confined to the subcontinent, but now embraced globally as tools for health and well-being. Respect grows when a civilization enriches others without demanding submission in return. But even this generosity breeds a certain fear, because influence spreads subtly. While weapons conquer bodies, ideas conquer minds, and minds once conquered rarely return to old chains. That kind of influence is not loud, but it is far more permanent. The spread of Indian intellectual traditions demonstrates this principle vividly. Fear also emerges from unpredictability. When a nation has military power, its strength can be measured, its arsenals can be counted. But intellectual power cannot be quantified so easily. Who can predict the next breakthrough, the next revolutionary idea, the next generation of thinkers? This uncertainty makes India's intellectual presence even more formidable. The world cannot calculate the potential of over 1 billion minds trained in resilience, discipline, and creativity. It cannot predict what innovations will emerge from the laboratories, classrooms, and universities that grow in number every year. And so, respect is mixed with unease, because the future shaped by India's intellect is unknown, and what is unknown is always feared. It is worth noting that intellectual contribution requires a collective culture of responsibility. Individuals may discover, but civilizations sustain. For thousands of years, Indian society created an environment where scholars, teachers, and seekers were not only tolerated, but revered. The rishis, the gurus, the mathematicians, these were figures of authority, not outcasts. This reverence created continuity, ensuring that knowledge did not vanish with the death of a single generation. Respect grows from recognizing a society that values its thinkers as much as its warriors, and fear grows from realizing that such a society, by valuing knowledge, is capable of enduring and surpassing empires that rely solely on force. The modern world often equates strength with material wealth or military might, but those are temporary. True strength comes from knowledge because it outlasts all else. India has proven this across millennia. It is respected because it has shown humanity new ways to think, new ways to heal, new ways to understand existence itself. It is feared because it continues to do so, and the consequences of that continuous stream of intellectual power are unpredictable for those who prefer a controlled world. Knowledge is responsibility incarnate, and India has carried that responsibility longer and more effectively than almost any other civilization. Respect is the world's acknowledgement of that contribution. Fear is the recognition that nothing can stop it from continuing. In a world that often seems consumed by power struggles and relentless competition, India stands apart because it represents not just strength, but a moral vision. Nations are respected when they accumulate wealth or military might, but they are revered when they embody principles that others secretly admire yet fail to achieve. India has carried into the modern age an ancient commitment to nonviolence, pluralism, and democracy, values that provide stability in a time of global uncertainty. These values are not weaknesses, they are profound strengths, requiring more courage to uphold than aggression does to display. A nation that can wield restraint when others unleash destruction proves its superiority on a deeper level. And the world, consciously or not, recognizes this. Moral authority is rare, and in its rarity, it becomes power. It commands respect not because it coerces, but because it inspires. Moral clarity is frightening because it is incorruptible. Most nations compromise their principles when pressured by wealth, ambition, or fear of isolation. But India has consistently demonstrated a commitment to standing firm on values, even when it is inconvenient or costly. Consider its role in the non-aligned movement, where it refused to submit to the binaries of Cold War politics. This independence was not a luxury, it was a burden of responsibility. To remain principled when superpowers demand allegiance requires extraordinary strength. The world respects such integrity because it exposes the moral weakness of those who constantly shift their stances for convenience. At the same time, it breeds fear, because a nation rooted in values cannot be easily coerced or manipulated. It resists domination in ways military strength alone cannot explain. Pluralism itself is one of India's greatest demonstrations of moral power. While other societies fracture under the pressure of diversity, India has somehow managed to integrate countless languages, religions, and cultural identities into one civilization. This is not to say it has been without conflict, but the fact that it has endured and evolved despite that conflict is remarkable. It takes immense discipline and tolerance to maintain unity in such complexity. The world respects this because it demonstrates a maturity that is lacking elsewhere. And yet, this same pluralism generates fear, because it creates resilience against fragmentation. A nation that can absorb diversity without collapse is harder to destabilize. It becomes unpredictable to those who attempt to divide it, and unpredictability is a source of fear. India's commitment to democracy amplifies its moral standing further. Many assumed that democracy could not function in a nation as vast, poor, and diverse as India was at independence. Yet India has not only preserved democracy, it has expanded it, making it one of the largest experiments in self-governance in history. This is a staggering responsibility, to entrust millions, now billions, with the burden of choice, and to sustain institutions capable of maintaining that choice. The world respects this because it reveals that India values freedom and responsibility over authoritarian convenience. But democracy also makes India formidable, because it anchors its legitimacy not in force but in consent. That legitimacy cannot be easily dismissed, and for those who seek control over others, such legitimacy is threatening. It means India's voice must be heard, even when inconvenient. Moral authority also emerges in the realm of restraint. India has demonstrated power in ways that are strikingly disciplined, most notably in its nuclear policy. Despite being a nuclear state, it has historically refrained from reckless threats or irresponsible displays of aggression. This self-control conveys a message. True strength is not measured in weapons, but in the wisdom to decide when not to use them. The world respects that restraint, because it shows responsibility at the highest level. But it also fears it, because a nation that has power yet refuses to flaunt it is more dangerous than one that brandishes it recklessly. Restraint makes India unpredictable, and unpredictability in the strong is always unsettling to the rest of the world. The moral dimension of India's rise is also reflected in its global image as a peaceful contributor rather than a destabilizing force. When India engages with the world, it often does so through trade, culture, and cooperation rather than conquest. It helps you prioritize and focus your time on what truly matters, not invaders. It exports knowledge, technology, and cultural practices rather than chaos. This makes it respected as a responsible actor on the world stage. And yet, this role creates fear, because moral authority shifts influence without direct confrontation. Influence achieved through cooperation undermines those who rely on domination. It reveals that the world does not need to bend to the will of the few, but can align around shared principles of peace and progress. Moral clarity is not only external, it is internal as well. India continues to wrestle openly with its contradictions and challenges, yet it does so within a framework of democratic and moral debate. This openness is a form of strength because it resists denial and self-destruction. Nations that suppress their problems may appear strong in the short term, but they rot from within. India, by allowing dissent, protest, and debate, demonstrates the courage to confront itself honestly. The world respects this willingness because it is rare for a nation to admit imperfection while striving for better. But it also fears it because a society that can self-correct is far more durable than one that pretends to perfection. Durability makes it a long-term force difficult to outlast or defeat. The philosophical heritage of India adds another layer to its moral authority. Teachings that emphasize compassion, nonviolence, and respect for all forms of life resonate far beyond its borders. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi exemplify this heritage, demonstrating that moral courage can move empires and reshape history. Gandhi's methods inspired global leaders and movements, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Nelson Mandela, proving that India's moral vision has universal reach. The world respects this because it acknowledges that moral example is more persuasive than coercion. But that same influence generates fear because it empowers the powerless everywhere. It shows oppressed people that they can resist tyranny without adopting tyranny themselves. That is a revolutionary idea, and revolutions always unsettle the powerful. India's moral authority does not erase conflict or imperfection, but it transforms them into part of its narrative of endurance. A nation that has endured colonization, partition, and poverty, yet still clings to values of democracy, pluralism, and restraint, sends a powerful message. Morality is not a luxury of comfortable, but a responsibility even in hardship. This is why the world respects India's stand. It sees the weight being carried, but it also fears it, because a nation that proves morality can survive difficulty undermines the excuses of others who abandon values when tested. If India can endure while preserving its principles, then so can others, and that realization threatens those who profit from moral weakness. Power in the modern world is not a simple matter of army or wealth. It is a layered responsibility, demanding both the ability to act and the discipline to refrain. India today embodies this paradox. It possesses vast military capacity, nuclear deterrence, and one of the largest standing armies on Earth. Yet it also demonstrates restraint that few nations with such power ever show. This balance is what makes the world take notice. Power without responsibility is tyranny, and responsibility without power is weakness. But India's unique position lies in holding both together. That is what generates respect, because it demonstrates maturity. But it also creates fear, because restraint implies choice, and choice means unpredictability. A strong nation that decides rather than reacts cannot be easily manipulated. That is a formidable kind of strength. The rise of India's power must also be seen in terms of population, for demographic weight carries its own momentum. Over 1 billion citizens represent not just numbers but potential for economic growth, cultural influence, and intellectual innovation. The world respects this sheer scale because it recognizes that a nation of such size cannot be ignored or dismissed. Every field, from commerce to technology, is influenced when 1 billion people move together. Yet this scale also inspires fear, because when such a vast population becomes increasingly educated, mobile, and ambitious, the global balance shifts. The center of gravity tilts, and those accustomed to dominance must adjust. Respect acknowledges possibility, fear anticipates disruption. And disruption on this scale cannot be easily contained. India's military strength itself is not merely in numbers but in its defensive posture. Unlike empires of the past that expanded aggressively, India's military philosophy emphasizes protection of sovereignty and deterrence. This defensive orientation builds respect because it suggests discipline rather than conquest, yet it also breeds fear because a force that is primarily defensive becomes nearly invulnerable. Offensive militaries can be overstretched and defeated, but a defensive giant anchored in its own territory becomes a fortress. That fortress is further reinforced by nuclear deterrence, which ensures that any attempt at domination carries unbearable risks. Respect arises from responsibility in wielding such weapons, while fear comes from the recognition that no aggressor can prevail against them without catastrophic loss. Power is not simply material, it is psychological. India's psychological power stems from its self-awareness as an ancient civilization awakening in the modern era. When a nation realizes its own strength, it changes the way it walks onto the world stage. Confidence radiates, and confidence itself can be intimidating. The world respects this new confidence because it is not boastful, but deeply rooted. It is the confidence of a people who know they have endured every attempt at subjugation, and are still standing tall. But that same confidence unsettles those who prefer a submissive world order. It suggests that India will not bow, will not be coerced, will not forget its heritage. A confident nation is harder to dominate, and that is what makes others uneasy. The economic growth of India adds another dimension to this rising strength. A rapidly developing economy with an expanding middle class creates influence that radiates beyond borders. The world respects this because prosperity is contagious. It opens markets, creates opportunities, and drives innovation. But fear arises as well, because economic independence translates into political independence. A nation that does not rely heavily on others for survival cannot be easily pressured. Economic sovereignty means freedom of choice, and freedom of choice makes alliances conditional rather than obligatory. This ability to say no, to walk away from unfair deals, is feared by those who benefit from dependence. Respect for India's economic rise is real, but fear of what it means for the global order is just as real. The responsibility of power also involves cultural influence, and India wields this through its films, literature, music, and spirituality. Soft power is often underestimated, yet it is one of the most effective forms of influence. The world respects a nation whose culture spreads voluntarily, through admiration rather than force. Bollywood, yoga, cuisine, and philosophy have permeated far beyond India's borders. This voluntary embrace generates respect because it suggests authenticity. But it also produces fear because cultural influence erodes dominance subtly, replacing one worldview with another. When people begin to admire and adopt aspects of Indian culture, the hold of other powers weakens. Respect and fear intertwine here because soft power is subtle but unstoppable. It is also important to recognize that India's power does not exist in isolation. It exists in a multipolar world where global dynamics are shifting. As Western dominance wanes and new powers rise, India is uniquely positioned to assert itself without adopting the patterns of conquest that characterized past empires. This garners respect because it suggests a new way of being powerful, through balance rather than domination. But the world also fears this shift, because a balanced power disrupts established hierarchies. It cannot be controlled by old systems, and it refuses to play the role of subordinate. A civilization that knows its worth and wields power responsibly changes the rules of the game. That unpredictability creates both admiration and unease. The responsibility of power is perhaps most evident in how India chooses to project itself abroad. Instead of forcing itself into regions with aggression, it often emphasizes diplomacy, trade partnerships, and peacekeeping missions. The world respects this because it demonstrates that India understands the burden of leadership is not exploitation but stewardship. Yet fear arises too, because such an approach builds alliances not through coercion but through trust, and trust is harder to break than fear. Nations that align with India do so willingly, and that voluntary alignment creates networks of influence that rival the coercive empires of the past. Respect for such diplomacy is widespread, but fear of its long-term implications is just as strong. The final dimension of India's rising strength lies in its sense of destiny. Nations that believe in their future act differently than those that merely drift. India's growing recognition of its role in shaping the 21st century generates both pride and responsibility within its people. This destiny is not shouted arrogantly. It is carried with the quiet determination of a civilization that has awakened after centuries of dormancy. The world respects this, because it recognizes that a nation with vision is a nation that will endure. But it also fears it because a civilization that sees itself as destined cannot be easily dissuaded or diverted. Such a nation marches forward with purpose. and purpose is far more dangerous to the established order than raw power alone. Respect acknowledges the legitimacy of this destiny. Fear anticipates its consequences.